You are listening to Middle East Monitor Conversations, bringing you lively discussions with prominent voices from the region and beyond, as we delve deeper into issues shaping the Middle East and North Africa, from politics, the culture, and the arts.
Hello and welcome to another conversation with the Middle East Monitor. My name is Nassim Ahmed and I will be your host today. We are discussing Orientalism, Ukraine and the social disease of selective solidarity. That's the title of an article by Dr. Suja Sawafta, who is my guest today. Suja is an assistant professor of Arabic studies in the Department of Modern Languages and Literature at the University of Miami. She's currently working on her first book project, which examines the impact of exile, intellectual commitment, and political dissent in the works of the formative Saudi-Iraqi novelist Abdulrahman Munif. She teaches interdisciplinary content courses on literature and cinema, as well as Arabic and French language. Welcome to the show, Suja, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Nassim.
And thanks to those who have tuned in to listen to this week's conversation. Before we proceed, I just want to say that, I hope that this discussion about racism and selective outrage at this moment does not mean we are insensitive to the humanitarian suffering we see every day. I want to say that at the outset that we stand in solidarity with the people of Ukraine, just as we stand in solidarity with all oppressed people whose country is being occupied by a foreign force. Yes, so with that, I want to begin, Suja, with a question about Orientalism itself. We will dive into the article you published for MEMO, which is still trending, one of the trending articles on our website. We are still talking about Orientalism. It's more than 4 decades. What is it about the book you think has made it timeless, and why is it still really important, relevant to our discussion?
Well, that question is a very important question. I find that even though the book itself was published in 1979, it kind of chronicles centuries-long fossilized cultural practices of Orientalism and Orientalist thought from the 1600s, 1700s, 1819, and going on to today. So while the book itself is relatively new, the phenomena that it discusses and talks about in terms of how international relations, cultural exchanges, colonization, the dissemination of power and knowledge, all of those things that are addressed in Orientalism as a book have been going on for centuries. And some of the representations specifically of quote unquote so-called Oriental subjects are images that have been fossilized and sort of in circulation since the Crusades. So the thing is that we don't see it necessarily, for those who aren't familiar, as something that we've been conditioned to believe in terms of what cultures are superior, what cultures are considered inferior. We don't see it within these economic realms of some places were deliberately developed in order to sustain and prop up other countries. And for a very long time, those countries were European ones. The thing about Orientalism is what it has come to mean has changed. So historically speaking, an Orientalist was someone who dedicated their career to studying the so-called Orient. And they are the people who established faculties of Oriental Studies, the School of Oriental and African Studies in the Sorbonne in London and Oxford and Cambridge and so on, these kind of iconic cultural learned institutions, and places like the Académie Française. And so it doesn't have to be a university, but just sort of like a center for knowledge production that aids and abets a country or a state. More recently, we refer to them as states, sort of foreign policies and or political interests. But what it has come to mean now is somebody who believes and perpetuates stereotypes that are often racist images and or ideas of Oriental or other subjects. So it doesn't have to be somebody from, say, what we call today the Middle East, North Africa, or Sub-Saharan Africa or Latin America, for example. It could be any person who is othered in relation to another group that has more cultural capital, social capital, economic privilege, and so on and so forth. So really what Orientalism, as Said has defined it, has come to mean is sort of, I guess historically the definition was, or the idea was, that Europe fashioned an image of cultural and political superiority in relation to an inferior and degenerate other. And we've come to kind of understand Orientalism as a racial and political power structure that explains who has capital at a certain point and who doesn't, and how that, the relationship between the two manifests according to that, who holds the power.
And for the benefit of our viewers who haven't read the book, I mean, it is quite a lengthy book. It's quite old as well. What are the some of the, because you mentioned policy, Orientalism informing Western foreign policy. What are some of the examples you could cite? Because Said's book really, most of it deals with classical Orientalism, by which I mean, the production of knowledge about the Middle East, Islam, and Muslims in the service of colonialism. British colonialism and whatnot. But empire in the classical sense does not exist, and yet Orientalism has been at the subterranean level of Western foreign policy. So what modern examples could we cite to show that Orientalism is still at the heart of much of Western thinking about the Muslim world in more recent times?
So in order to fully be able to cite those examples, I think it's helpful to understand the difference between latent and manifest Orientalism. So latent Orientalism refers to sort of that archive of symbols that I talked about. Things like, Aladdin, camels, snake charmers, things like that, like stereotypical images and or fossilized ideas about the Orient and or Oriental subjects that have been sustained for centuries and evolve depending on what the cultural moment is. So right now we're in a pop cultural moment. But, if we're talking about literature of the Crusades, the Sarrazin in Islamic Spain was considered the sort of archetypical enemy of the West at that time. And manifest Orientalism, from how I understand it, is how Orientalism kind of interacts with our world. And that's the part that, it's informed by these stereotypical, like almost static symbols of cultural inferiority. But the way that it interacts with our political and cultural moment is the manifest aspect. And so perhaps I think within our lifetime, the so-called war on terror is perhaps the most blatant example of that. And Laura Bush, kind of in the United States, went on TV to advocate for the saving of Muslim women from Muslim men in Iraq and Afghanistan. That would be an example of Orientalism, this idea that there is a vulnerable population, it's often gendered, that don't know any better and they need to be saved. And the only person who can save them, or the only, I guess, agent that can provide that change, is usually a white, the white man, historically speaking. But in the case of this, it would be the US Army, right? But it is, again, in history and in literary examples, we have that poetry about, the white man's burden and so on and so forth. So Orientalism played a huge role in justifying and mandating the invasion and occupation of Iraq and Afghanistan. And it continues to be the case in how certain crises in the Arab world and other places are portrayed in our media outlets. So why, for example, is Palestine portrayed a certain way versus how the Syrian crisis is, versus, our attention slipping away from Yemen and so on and so forth. Orientalism kind of helps to explain why certain places are more worthy of our interest in the public psyche than others. But I would say perhaps the most blatant example is the Bush administration and every subsequent US administration's kind of positioning in their role and duty to export democracy to these places, but that was just a myth. And so the saving of brown women and Muslim women through this like pseudo-feminist narrative would be an example.
Yeah, I mean, speaking about the Bush administration, the Iraq War and War on Terror, the heart of that administration was one of the most well-known Orientalists of all, Bernard Lewis, and he was advising the Bush administration at the time. Yeah, so turning to your article on the disease of selective outrage, you mentioned that you wanted to shake your students up, shake your students from their comfort zone. I think I kind of felt that as well, watching observing, the news and watching journalists for the last couple of weeks. You got a sense of a rude awakening of the position of, Muslims and non-European Anglo-Saxons living in the West. And is that what you wanted to do? Do you think, we need a rude awakening like this to remind us that, Orientalism and the framing of non-whites is still prevalent and shapes much of, how non-Muslims see the world and see Muslims and Black people?
There's a two-part answer to that question. And one answer comes from, I would say, let me just backtrack a little and say that for me, it's difficult, but necessary work to illuminate certain, what I consider like sustained examples of political injustice, particularly as I teach in a US-based university. And so here we have these myths that, from grade school, students are told this is the land of the free, the home of the brave, you can achieve anything here. This is a country unlike any other. And sometimes it takes living in a different context to understand the level of that myth, right? And the fact that, just 150 years ago, we didn't have integration. And, just 50 years ago, we didn't have integration in terms of between the races in the United States. So within the US, we're speaking specifically within a settler colonial context, and one that was founded on genociding the native inhabitants and enslaving an entire population and continuously scapegoating immigrant population after immigrant population, Chinese, Russian, Irish, Italian, now Arab and Latinx. So we have this pattern in the United States of using Orientalism in order to fashion an American identity. And it's often by excluding or demonizing certain groups and not contending with our own violent history of how this nation was formed and why in the US we still have things like school shootings and, neo-Nazi and KKK raids on protests and so on and so forth. So it always comes as there's always a point where I have to pause and be like, okay, we're about to show, we're about to illuminate why these things happen in a certain capacity. As far as I'm concerned, I see capitalism as, a direct product of colonialism. And I see Orientalism as sort of an ideology that mandated the colonial project. So if you think about something like the transatlantic slave trade, Orientalism was used to dehumanize an entire continent, the continent of Africa, in order to enslave those people and kind of dragoon them into the service of an economic need for the US and Europe at the time. These borders, these countries, they change. But, we think about, cotton, sugar, rice, things that we now know as cash crops that needed free labor and enslaved labor in order to produce them at the level that the globe wanted. And that has, you have to use Orientalism, which is a form of racism, to dehumanize a population in order to, again, justify, quote unquote, enslaving them. If you don't see them as human, then anything that you do and project onto that subject is a valid sort of thing. Obviously, that's problematic, right? But so I see it as an evolution from, the ways in which the US, for example, was founded by genociding Native American populations to bringing over this economic workforce through enslavement. And any kind of subsequent sort of US foreign policy is one that, in a way, stems from this legacy of violence. But Orientalism lies at the core of it, because Orientalism it explains why certain populations are dehumanized, if that makes sense. And so then, any subsequent sort of industrial or contemporary advancement that we've seen through technology, like plastic, is something that is a product of oil extraction from the Arabian Peninsula and other places, and some of the places we're talking about today. So even something like single-use plastic is a product of an Orientalist encounter. For example, the narratives that we have of oil company consortiums arriving in the Arabian Peninsula and dispossessing Bedouins from their land in order to prop up oil refineries like Aramco are almost identical to narratives that we have of Columbus meeting Native Americans for the first time. So the language hasn't changed, and the context changes, and the way that it sort of perpetuates or fossilizes in each national context is different, but the core tenets of Orientalism are the same. And it explains a great deal.
Yes, I mean, this goes back to what you mentioned earlier about the latent Orientalism and the manifest Orientalism. Latent there, they exist at the underbelly. You don't really see the latent racism and essentialization, which takes place and manifests publicly and politically in different time and different context. So I think, which is why even for someone like me, I was quite taken back by some of the coverage. I was quite shocked by, for example, openly saying, "Oh, it's because they have blonde hair and blue eyes, therefore they've been allowed in." And that's just one example. There's so many other examples which kind of shocked me as well. And I'm thinking, it was for me a kind of a reminder, and it did kind of was a rude awakening for me. But so with your students, and you teach this subject, do you think we need to make Orientalism compulsory reading so that people really understand the dynamics of how the lens through which the West generally sees the other or creates the other? And it should be compulsory, education at schools, at university. Of course, there's a backlash, against this kind of literature with the rise of the rise of right-wing governments, and they generally dislike Said and literature from the left, which questions existing hierarchies, which questions the status quo, and on the humanities generally around universities in the West, there's an attack. But I think the way I look at it, there's a greater need to emphasize the template and the framing which Said offers to us and educate that, impart that to the next generation. And do you think that should be more the case, and it should be more resistance to efforts to sideline the likes of Said and his framing of politics and society?
I would certainly hope that anyone who has access to the book would read it, and that would be among the list for me of other critical essential readings, like the work of Frantz Fanon or Asya Jabbar and many other writers from the Global South. I just say Global South to kind of talk about these general terms, not that I necessarily agree with these, divisions, but it's just easier to kind of give a name in that way. Writers who are active agents in producing knowledge, where, in colonial context, where, for example, France would have never seen a writer like Fanon from Martinique, or Britain would have never seen a writer like Said from Palestine as capable of producing this type of knowledge, and they've been largely divorced from intellectual production in the stereotypical way that they've been represented. And so we see these often as like exceptions to what these people are capable of. But again, it shows that, for me, that the colonized individual, or the person who's a victim of colonization rather, is someone who has been actively involved in their liberation since the onset of the colonial machine. I would certainly hope that everyone who has access to that kind of language and is able to read the book would read the book. I do think in many ways it has completely changed post-colonial studies, or the way that we study cultural studies in many Western institutions. So I think that change is already underway, but you still have institutions across the world that are, considered elite universities, for example, that are very keen to preserve their status, which is one like Oxford, like, the University of Virginia, like Harvard, like many of these places literally built by enslaved and or lower people who have been considered like lower economic status. These are the people who build these institutions, physically speaking, but they are, for example, UVA, University of Virginia, is a university that has had to contend with its colonial legacy, particularly because Thomas Jefferson was the founder, and they used to house enslaved people below the ground, the students above them and the professors above them. So there's actually a physical hierarchy at play even within the architecture. And yet Orientalism is taught at the university, but it's not taught in relation to the history of that university, if that makes sense. So I would say in one aspect, it's already changing. The conversation has been changing the last few decades, but we still have a long way to go because of the selective nature of solidarity and outreach and the way in which we see certain groups' humanity as greater by default than others. So we still have some work to go, but I would say the work is underway.
Yeah, so returning to your article again, selective outreach. I think generally, one thing that struck me is, the mainstream media, there isn't even an effort to acknowledge that there is selective outrage or selective solidarity. But in the UK, there's one example yesterday I recall where a presenter on LBC, which is the biggest radio station here in the UK, one of the presenters basically asked his listeners, Putin dropped the same bombs in Syria, triggering a massive refugee crisis. People poured into Europe, many died, in crossing the channels. But these same bombs are now being dropped in Ukraine. And where is your, question your solidarity with the Ukrainians now? Where was your solidarity with the Syrians when they fled? So that's just one example of the mainstream media actually asking the British public to think about their racism, underlying racism. Has there been anything similar in the US to jolt people into thinking about, look at the double standards, look at the selective outrage that is, pervasive within the mainstream media? Is there anything like that in the US? I just found two examples in the UK. Generally, the discussion has been on social media. There's been really nothing on the mainstream media. And what I just gave you was just one of the rare examples.
With the United States, I think the problem, I guess, is that you're talking about a country that spans an entire continent. So you have so many different local news stations, and then obviously the national media conglomerates. I would say, from what I've observed, the first person to counter this narrative of, relatively civilized, relatively European, which were the exact words being used in many of these reports on Ukraine, was Ayman Muhyiddin from MSNBC. And then obviously the political shows that we have here, like Trevor Noah, did a reportage on it as well. So I would say that, again, it's people who are from minority groups that happen to be in the media that were the first to sort of call out the rhetoric that's being used. And also, I think it's interesting because social media has played a huge role in being the first to highlight the double standards in media coverage, particularly on this case, in comparison to, for example, almost 8 months ago with the fall of Kabul. What we had was, a lot of perhaps popular level solidarity and sympathy, but nothing really comparable on the global level. And I think it's interesting because Afghanistan is a country that was forever altered by the USSR invasion. So it's also a victim of this broader Russian or Soviet foreign policy, but again, nothing comparable in our coverage of it on Western media outlets. And again, it's almost as if, it's Afghanistan doomed to this existence, or Biden just a few weeks ago seizing that entire country's assets. And I think it was something along the lines of paying victims of 9/11 from, that it doesn't make any sense, right? So we have this selective kind of solidarity by default. We've been conditioned to say this shouldn't happen in Europe, and it's inherent to places where there are people who are melanated. And I just want to say, I think some of the detractors to my article were saying, oh, nice of her to use the race card. I wasn't the one to use the race card. I was responding to the race card that was being used very blatantly by commentators and political leaders in response to this crisis. Blonde hair, and I'm emotional because there are people with blonde hair and blue eyes on the border being killed every day. Ukrainian refugees in Spain, just a couple of days ago, Ukrainian refugees are welcome here, Muslim ones are not. I'm not the person who came up with this, with the use of the race card. I was just responding to what I saw as sort of a very blatant division of like, or I guess a bias in how this coverage was held, especially, you know, with regards to Syria and Afghanistan in particular, perhaps Palestine last May. Also, I would say that the majority of the coverage that was fair and just in this particular case of Israeli aggression was largely due to social media lighting up and not necessarily mainstream news outlets caring about the dispossession of residents in Sheikh Jarrah and Silwan and so on and so forth. And no comparable sanctions were made against other military aggressors by FIFA, and and with the exception of Ben and Jerry's, no other corporation stopped their sales. So again, it's this idea of why certain groups and not others.
Yeah, which brings us back to the question of double standards, and as you mentioned, Sheikh Jarrah and BDS. One area where double standards is so visible, on our face is, of course, the way the Israeli occupation of Palestine and how that's being covered. I noticed, however, there are pro-Israeli groups really trying hard to separate the Israeli occupation of Palestine with the Russian invasion and occupation of now Ukraine, and said, no, these are completely two different things. Don't conflate the two. And some have even suggested, this is just another way of singling out Israel, anti-Semitism and whatnot. But I think it's really any fair-minded person when watches this would say, look, boycott is okay there, but boycott is not right there. Occupation is tolerated in Palestine, but occupation is no longer tolerated. I think a lot of fair-minded people will now think deeply about the Palestinian issue itself. Hopefully, when this crisis ends. I mean, are you optimistic of that as well? That once the Russian invasion comes to an end, there will be a different media landscape, and it will be much, much harder to simply brush aside Israel's ongoing human rights abuse and occupation, and Israeli apartheid will become even more of a point of discussion in universities and also in mainstream media. You can't simply brush that off. Are you hopeful of that? I am.
I think with the events in May in Jerusalem, in occupied Jerusalem, I think that we've already seen a significant change in this last sort of outburst, for lack of a better word, that I haven't seen in my lifetime. Growing up in the post-Oslo honeymoon period and the subsequent, intifada and sort of that thing. That all of those things. This is the first instance in which I've seen that massive international sort of kind of challenging of media narratives as it pertains to Palestine specifically. But I don't know as to what the scale will be in terms of any future coverage of anything that would happen there. But my argument is just that what we're seeing in terms of global reactions to the crisis in Ukraine should be the standard for all humanitarian crises and all crises facing vulnerable populations. And the fact that it isn't, for the most part, the standard, the global standard for solidarity is the issue here, right? And if we're going to take it back to Ukraine, the commentary that I particularly had with regards to sort of my bringing in Orientalism as sort of part of the argument of why I was countering or challenging these like narratives on coverage of Ukraine, it just, to me, it baffles me because I don't think a comparable sort of international outcry happened for Bosnian Muslims. Again, like I wrote in the article, many of whom are white and have fair skin and blue eyes, happened in the 90s because they were Muslim, and or we didn't see that kind of care for Jewish victims of the Holocaust. And I think that rhetoric, to me, the rhetoric of, blue eyes, blonde hair, is Nazi rhetoric, and it's dangerous that it's being brought back into sort of like this call for action for Ukraine. I think that's very dangerous language to be bringing back and reviving. And so I don't really know, but I would hope that, I think, at least with social media, as problematic as some of the statements that have been circulating are, there's also a great deal of kind of public accountability now. People are questioning, and they're not waiting on news outlets to give us, the solid truth. People are countering these narratives and providing infographics and providing information in general, which I think will change the scope and the landscape more broadly, because people are now involved in researching and finding out for themselves and not fully trusting anything that is, this is on CNN, so it must be true, for example, or the BBC, or so on and so forth.
Well, I'm certainly optimistic. We are coming to the end of our time, but I wanted to ask you one last question. Being a devil's advocate here, I wonder if we are being a bit unfair, because Germany did allow in Merkel, certainly, 1.5 million Syrians, and Germany has some of the biggest names in Orientalism in terms of Orientalist studies. They have some of the biggest scholars and names in that field. But they don't seem to have this underbelly or deep-rooted assumptions and framing of the Middle East, which has prevented Merkel anyway from rejecting 1.5 million Syrian refugees. Do you see a contrast there? What's unique about Germany? I think Said mentions something unique about German Orientalism, and what is unique about it, which is not the case, say, here in France or the UK or other European countries?
I think, here, the thing is, it goes back to, my original point of the core tenets of Orientalism are the same in every context, but how they manifest and its legacy is different. So think of it this way, how, for example, the Lebanon and Algeria were both colonized by the French, but the reception of the French in both Lebanon and Algeria is very different. And in return, the way that French citizens of Lebanese descent are treated in the social sphere differs greatly from the way that North Africans are treated in the social sphere. So it seems, for example, that French Orientalism directly targets people of North African descent. I would say German Orientalism probably directly targets people of Turkish descent, right? But again, I think the point that you made is extremely important, because it shows the danger of speaking in absolutes and saying, this place is bad, this place is good, this place is civilized, this place is barbaric. I think the precedent that Germany set with its acceptance of 1.5 million Syrian refugees, again, is a very important precedent, and one would hope is sort of, again, a global standard for solidarity and asylum for all vulnerable populations. I will say that the brief period in 2015 and 2016 in which the Syrian refugee crisis caught our global attention was an important one. But again, at that time, there was also a bit of Orientalism at play, because they weren't the only migrants making that journey. They were accompanied by migrants from sub-Saharan Africa, from Afghanistan, from Iraq, and other places. But the highlight was specifically Syrian. That's not to say it wasn't deserving, but again, there was a focus on Syrians, specifically white passing Syrians, right, in the media. So Orientalism is still at play. But I think the good takeaway, let's end on an optimistic note, I too am optimistic that things are changing, is that what Germany, the precedent Germany set at that time, should be the standard, not the exception. And that's the point that I was trying to make.
No, I agree with you. And I think the subject you raise in your article is really important. I think it's going to be an ongoing debate. And we look forward to continuing this debate. I think it's been very interesting. And I look forward to, as you say, the invasion of Ukraine being, and the reaction to it being a model for Europe in how it should treat refugees, because there is going to be no doubt more and more refugees coming from the Muslim world, and we can hold that up as a standard. This is the way to behave when you're dealing with vulnerable people, refugees fleeing persecution, and also a model and standard on how you deal with occupation, and hopefully that will also shift the debate and accept BDS, because at the moment there's such an attack on BDS here in the UK and around the world, in the US, efforts to prescribe it. So hopefully that will also shift. But it's all been, it's been fantastic conversation. I really enjoyed it. I enjoyed reading the article. Hopefully we can have another conversation, in the future soon. Thank you for joining us, Suja, and also those who have joined us from home, and hope to see you again soon. Take care and bye-bye.
This was Middle East Monitor Conversations, brought to you by the Middle East Monitor in London.